All right, everybody have a seat. Jurors, everybody's okay? I got to ask Ms. Higgs, do you have a specialty sport? Personally, or you teach?
Yeah, I teach PE, so no specialty with the teaching. I did track and gymnastics.
When you were in college?
No. Don't ask why.
I'm just jealous. You carry a whistle, I presume.
No?
No?
No, we have the microphones.
I've been dying to use a whistle in here.
No.
Oh, the whistle's great. It works. It's a great job. Thank you for doing that. Really, teaching is an honorable profession. Okay, I think we're ready to get started. State, who's your next witness?
State calls Omar Felix.
Mr. Felix, come on up, sir. And good afternoon, and thank you for your patience. Raise your right hand and face Mr. Clerk for me.
Please solemnly swear or affirm the evidence you're about to give the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Yes, sir.
Right up here. Watch your step. Make yourself comfortable. Please talk directly into the microphone for me. And once you get situated there, could you tell us your full name and slowly spell it for us?
Sure. My name is Omar Felix. Last name is spelled F-E-L-I-X.
Terrific. State, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Mr. Felix.
Good afternoon.
How are you today?
Good.
How are you currently employed?
I'm currently employed by the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. Specifically, I'm assigned to the Firearms Identification Unit in the Crime Laboratory.
Can you tell us about your qualifications that make you suited for that position in working in the Firearms Lab?
Sure. I have a bachelor's degree in forensic science from the University of Central Florida, and I also have a master's degree in applied psychology from Lynn University.
Okay. Any training outside of your formal education as it relates to your job?
I am trained as a forensic firearms examiner.
Okay. Can you tell us about your experience as a forensic examiner?
Sure. Well, my training actually was with my previous employer, with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement's Orlando Crime Laboratory. And the training consisted of approximately a year and a half of firearms training, learning how firearms function, and also microscopic work, meaning being able to compare fired evidence to firearms that fired those pieces of evidence.
Okay. And how long were you with the office in Orlando?
I was with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for 7 years.
And after you left Florida Department of Law Enforcement, where did you go?
I started with the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office was about almost 12 years ago.
Okay. And what exactly is it that you do in the Firearms Lab?
Well, what I do is I examine evidence, firearms evidence specifically. I examine firearms to determine whether they're functional or not. And then I would examine fired casings and fired bullets to determine whether they were fired in that specific firearm, or in the case without a firearm, to determine whether they were fired in the same gun or not.
As a part of your job with the Sheriff's Department, do you receive requests to make comparisons and analysis from other agencies within the county?
Yes. For the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, we don't only work cases for the Sheriff's Office. We work for any police agency within the county. We also work federal cases, assisting the FBI and ATF with any cases that they have.
Okay. And I want to go back to what it is that you do, and you mentioned using a microscope.
Yes.
Could you tell us more about that?
Sure. I use the microscope primarily as the primary piece of equipment. And specifically what I use is what's called a comparison microscope. Now, a comparison microscope, all that is two microscopes connected so I could see both sides at the same time. I would put one piece of evidence on one side and then put a test fire or another piece of evidence on the other side and then examine them to determine whether they were fired in the same firearm or not.
What do you mean when you say a test fire?
Well, a test fire is when I would take the firearm and shoot it into a water tank. And the reason why I shoot it into a water tank is so that I could retrieve any of the evidence undamaged. So that test fire is then used to compare to any evidence from any suspect evidence from the crime scene.
And in order to do that comparison, as it relates to firearms,
Yes.
is every firearm different?
Yes, what basically happens is that at the microscopic level, all firearms are unique. There are random imperfections that happen during the manufacturing of that firearm. So what happens is that when the gun is fired, it'll either scratch or impress the casing or the bullet in a unique way. So it basically, every gun has, for lack of a better phrase, has its own fingerprint. So when the gun is fired, this fingerprint is now impressed onto the evidence. So that's the evidence that I would put on the comparison microscope and then compare to either other evidence or the test fire of the firearm.
Okay, and because of, correct me if I'm wrong, because the firearm is unique, if you have the firearm and you put a cartridge in and you fire that gun, if it is identified as a match, the imprint or imperfection should be the same on both.
Yes, so basically, once I test fire the gun, now I have markings from that gun that I know that I fired it. So then I would compare those under the comparison microscope to see if it has the same pattern as any of the evidence. If it has the same pattern, they were fired from the same gun.
Okay. And when you receive a firearm, do you always receive ammunition with it?
Not always. It really depends on what's collected. Sometimes I'll get firearms with ammunition, and sometimes not.
Okay. And we're going to get into what you did. Well, let me ask you, what were you asked to do in this case, the Sheriff's Department case number 17-010270?
I was just asked to examine firearms and different types of ammunition.
Okay. And before we get into your analysis, I kind of want to we've used a lot of terminology in relating to whether it's a bullet, projectile, or fragment. So I just want to be clear about the proper terminology for each of those.
Sure.
I'm going to show you some items that have already been admitted into evidence. And oftentimes, I believe we refer to, show you, this is State's Exhibit 153. I'm just going to use it right here on the overhead.
Okay.
What is the property of what we see here?
Well, what's up here is the proper name is what's called a cartridge. Sometimes there's a lot of misused terminology. Sometimes it'll be called a bullet, or sometimes it's considered a live round. But a cartridge is composed of 4 basic things, and that is the casing, which is the green casing tube-looking thing on the bottom there. Inside of that casing is the gunpowder. And then on the bottom, if you were to turn it on its side or look at the bottom part, there's a little silver or sometimes brass disc. And it's called a, yep, there you go. That little brass disc there is called a primer. And then you have on the top there, the copper pointed end is actually the bullet or the projectile. So that's really what when someone is calling a bullet or projectile, that's what they're talking about. Now what happens, I'm sorry? Correct, yes, that copper-looking part. And now what happens is that when the trigger is pulled, the firing mechanism goes off, and a firing pin or hammer will hit the primer, the bottom disc. And what happens is that disc actually creates a spark. That's all it does. It just it creates a spark on the inside of that cartridge. That spark ignites the gunpowder, and that's what creates the explosion, which pushes the bullet or projectile out of the barrel towards the target, and then the casing is then expelled out of the firearm, and then a new cartridge is then loaded into the firearm to be fired.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, this is actually what commonly we refer to as a bullet, as this in its entirety is actually a cartridge.
Correct. The terminology is a cartridge, which is a live round.
A live round. And what we see here at the top is actually the bullet.
Correct. That's the bullet or projectile.
And
Yes.
so this is what actually projects
Correct.
out of the firearm.
Correct.
Okay. And when you talk about firearms, they're almost like a defect, but it makes them unique, is that right? Like when it fires from the gun and you're making the comparison?
Yes, so what happens is, again, during the firing process, you have a lot of pressure and a lot of heat. So that pressure is what causes the impressions on the firearm to then be impressed onto the casings. So in other words, if you were to look at the primer, it's a relatively soft type of metal, and you want it to be relatively soft so that the firing pin can hit it and actually detonate the cartridge. Well, what happens is that because it's a relatively soft piece of metal, it slams back into the firearm, which has the unique markings on it. So now that primer is now going to have the fingerprint or unique markings of that gun. And now with the projectile, it's slightly different. With the projectile, what happens is that as it's traveling down the barrel, it'll actually scratch. Again, the imperfections in the barrel will actually scratch the bullet in a certain pattern. And that's the pattern that is then compared to any other evidence.
And are there instances where if this cartridge is fired, that what we now know is the bullet, sometimes when crime scene goes out and they collect evidence from the crime, could the bullet still be somewhat intact?
It can be. It can be intact, meaning that there's no damage to it, or it can, upon impact, create lots of fragments and actually break up.
Okay. And even if it's a fragment, are you ever able to make an identification to a specific firearm?
I can sometimes. What happens is as long as there's a pattern that survives whatever damage, if there's a pattern to be compared to any of the test fires or any other evidence, I can make a comparison, yes.
Okay. And I'm going to show you, okay, well, let me ask you this. So we talked about that what is sometimes referred to as a bullet, proper name is a cartridge.
Correct, cartridge,
And
yes.
we talked about the bullet is actually what projects out of the firearm.
Correct,
Okay. Now there's the other part of it, the casing.
yes.
Okay, and is that what remains behind in the firearm, or where does the casing go?
Well, it depends on the type of firearm, but the casing usually in a semi-automatic system, meaning that as soon as the cartridge is fired, the firearm will actually extract and eject the empty casing out of the firearm and then load a new one, a new cartridge into the chamber to be fired.
Okay, and this is from Exhibit 112. And would this be an example of the casing?
Yes, that's the casing. So there would be no gunpowder on the inside because it would be fired. And then if you were to look at the little round disc, unfortunately, well, you may be able to tell on that, on the image there, but there's a slight dimple in that, oh, there you go, perfect. That little dimple there is what actually is caused by the firing pin. And you can actually, around that dimple and even within the dimple, there are going to be markings, again, from that firearm.
Now, when the cartridge is fired from a firearm, is there a general direction that the casing will go? If you have the gun, you fire the gun, obviously, bullet comes out of the front of the gun, where does the casing go?
Well, it really depends on the firearm itself. Most firearms are designed with what's called an ejection port on the right-hand side of the firearm. So it's typically designed so when the gun is fired, it will fire, and then the casing is ejected out of the right-hand side. However, it could, there's many factors to determine where those casings will actually land, though.
What do you mean by that?
Well, first, what would happen is if the ejection port is on the right-hand side, it actually really would depend on whether the casing goes forward to the right, perpendicular to the gun, just completely to the right, or even back to the right. But then also it would depend on how the firearm is being held. If the firearm is being held like a normal shooter would, it would eject to the right. However, if the gun is turned on its side sideways, the ejection pattern and the port are now up. So now the casing could really go left or right. So there's a lot of factors as to where the casing would land when holding a firearm.
Okay. And okay, so we've gone over a cartridge, a casing, and a projectile. We'll come back to a fragment. But can you just give us an idea of what a fragment would be?
A fragment is just a part of whatever is that we're talking about. So if it's a fragment of a projectile, it just means that upon impact, that projectile broke up, and a fragment is just a piece of that projectile. That's all that is.
Okay. Now, going back to this particular case,
Yes.
Were you assigned this case to work on?
Yes.
Okay. And when you get a case is assigned to you, what is the first thing that you do?
Well, first what I would do is actually request the evidence from our evidence unit. The evidence unit is just a unit in the crime lab that stores evidence. That's all they do. Once they retrieve the evidence, I sign for the evidence. So basically what happens is there's something called a chain of custody where I'm signing over for that evidence on a certain day and a certain time, and then until I return that evidence to the evidence unit, I'm in control and possession of all those pieces of evidence. So once I retrieve the evidence, I begin my examination. Basically, I would go through each piece of evidence, take notes, take photographs, and then do any type of examination, and then write a report at the end.
Okay. And I'm going to stop you for just a second.
That's okay.
Just to go back.
Sure.
To show to the jury, this is Exhibit 304.
I can see it, yes.
And this would be an example of a fragment?
That would be a fragment because it's just a piece of a projectile.
Okay. Just wanted to get all of
That's okay.
all the different parts of it.
Sure.
Okay. So you talked about when you request the evidence and you take it back to Firearms Lab, is that
Yes,
correct?
yes.
When you're assigned a case, do you get any information as to what happened, like the nature of the case?
No, typically not. What happens is usually it's just an email usually it's just an email that comes in that says, to work the case. And then I would take the case number and then go and request the evidence itself.
And in this particular case, I take it well, let me ask you this. You received firearms?
Yes.
Okay. And one of the firearms that is listed, did you receive a Taurus revolver?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And what was that marked as a submission number?
The Taurus revolver was marked as submission 3.
Okay. And when you are receiving these firearms and or ammunition to go along with it, is it usually labeled with a submission number?
Yes, the submission number how it's listed in the report is just basically how the evidence assigns that piece of evidence. So in other words, a police officer will come to the evidence unit, fill out the paperwork, and then give it to the evidence unit. The evidence unit then assigns a submission number to it, then a unique case number to that piece of evidence. So there's no sequential order necessarily in the submission numbers. It's just that's the way the evidence unit assigned it. That package was submission 3 in this particular case.
Okay. And what did you receive with submission 3?
With submission 3, I received a .357 Magnum caliber Taurus Model 605 titanium revolver, serial number XI36646. And then I also received 5 Perfecta. Perfecta is just a manufacturer of the cartridges of .357 Magnum caliber.
And did you test fire that firearm?
Yes, I did.
And did you find it to be functioning?
Yes.
Okay. Moving on to submission 4, did you receive a Glock pistol?
Yes, I received a .40 Smith & Wesson caliber Glock Model 23 semi-automatic pistol, serial number ZVA440. I received 1 pistol magazine and 24 Perfecta 40 Smith & Wesson caliber cartridges.
Okay. And what was the first thing you did when you got this firearm you requested it from evidence and you received it in the lab?
Yes, I did a standard examination, which was after opening up the box, take notes, take the make, the model, the serial number, the caliber, and then determine any type of unusual markings, determine whether it was potential any parts broken, and then again make notes. And then later on, I would test fire the firearm.
And did you test fire this 40 caliber Glock?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you've called out a lot of numbers.
Sure.
Can you tell us the significance of, it's 40 Smith & Wesson caliber?
Yes.
What does that mean?
40 Smith & Wesson caliber, well, first, I probably should just describe what caliber is. Caliber, all that means is it's just the size of the ammunition. It's just the type of ammunition that's going to be used in a particular firearm. So in other words, this particular size of ammunition is 40 Smith & Wesson. Now, the Smith & Wesson doesn't have anything to do with this particular type of firearm. It just means that actually Smith & Wesson, the company, designed that cartridge. That's all that means. So they designed the cartridge. So that size ammunition is designed to be fired in any firearm from any manufacturer that is 40 Smith & Wesson caliber. Just like any other caliber, like the .357 Magnum caliber revolver. .357 Magnum ammunition, that size, is designed to be only fired from firearms that are .357 Magnum, and so on and so forth.
Okay. May sound like a crazy question, but
That's good.
I've shown you, you described the different parts of the bullet, and so we obviously see that there is a visual distinction between these two different types of cartridges.
Correct, yes.
And is it something in some instances or all the time that you can make the determination that, let's say the bullets we have on the left, I don't know if it's just, I always say what size bullets they are.
The cartridges, no, I can't, that's okay. No, not from, visually, not from up there, no.
Okay. Typically, would you say that these two different types of bullets would not necessarily go into the same type of firearm?
Yes, that's correct. Visually, you could just tell that they're two different sizes, so they'll be two different calibers, yes.
So going back to the 40 Glock pistol, you stated you received a magazine?
Yes, a magazine, again, just for clarity, a magazine is sometimes referred to as a clip, but again, that's the correct terminology would be the magazine, and the magazine is just the box or the holder of unfired ammunition or the cartridges. So you would load the cartridges in the magazine and then put that in the firearm to be fired.
And were you able to determine how many cartridges were in the pistol magazine?
If I check my notes,
That refresh your recollection?
sure, yes.
Yes.
Yes, I just wanted to make sure. No, I did not receive the magazine with any type of ammunition inside of the magazine itself.
Okay.
The ammunition was separate, I'm sorry.
Did you receive separate ammunition?
Yes, correct, in a separate envelope within that box.
Okay, with the firearm.
Correct.
And do you recall if in the items you received what might be referred to as an extended magazine? Like that might stick out below the hand grip of the gun?
Yes, the type of magazine on this was considered an extended magazine, meaning that it was longer. This type of firearm, typically, the magazine that the manufacturer would put with the firearm when it's being sold, sometimes will hold 15 cartridges, sometimes 10 cartridges, sometimes 8. This magazine actually held 29 cartridges, so that's why it's considered an extended magazine, because it holds a very large amount of ammunition.
Versus standard?
Correct. The standard, I believe it's anywhere from 10 to 15 for this particular model. I don't know off the top of my head, but it's around that range.
Okay. And I don't recall if you told us, when you got the gun, did you test fire it?
I did test fire, yes.
Okay. And what was your findings as to the test fire?
The firearm was functional.
Okay, it was functional. Once you make the determination that a firearm is functional, what is the next thing that you do?
Well, in this particular case, then, actually, I would fire all the firearms at the same time. So I'll just skip ahead. Then basically what I would do is if there's any fired ammunition, any fired casings or fired bullets that are the same caliber, 40 caliber, I would then use the microscope, as I mentioned before, to compare any of the evidence, fired casings or fired bullets, to any of the test fires from this 40 caliber, 40 Smith & Wesson caliber pistol.
And was that, I know you said you test fired all of them, but specifically about this particular gun, this 40 caliber pistol, were you able to make some identifications and did a comparison, some of which may have been inconclusive?
Yes, there were two different types of conclusions based on, depending on the type of evidence that I compared.
Okay. So I want to go through some of the submissions you received.
Okay?
As it pertains to the 40 caliber Glock pistol.
Yes.
Did you receive a submission 6?
Yes.
Okay. And was there anything in submission 6 pertaining to the Glock pistol?
Yes, in submission 6, there were 5 fired cartridge casings that were 40 Smith & Wesson caliber.
Okay. And when we say fired cartridge casings, we're referring to?
Just the brass casings themselves.
Okay. And I'm going to just put this up. This is States 112. This would be 40 caliber casing.
Yes, I believe so. On the bottom of the casing, it would actually say the actual caliber itself.
I'm going to approach so you can take a look.
Sure. Yes, that is a 40 Smith & Wesson caliber cartridge casing.
And you were able to make a determination as to how many casings you are able to identify as being fired from the Glock pistol?
Yeah, I was able to identify all 5 cartridge casings as being fired from that Glock pistol.
Okay. And what were those casing numbers?
All of them that were in submission 6. So the casings, the casing numbers were 17 and 19 through 22.
Now, Mr. Felix, when you get a case, you told us that you don't really have any type of factual.
I'm sorry, you just dropped a cartridge there.
You don't really have any type of factual basis as to what happened. Do you
No.
have any information as to where they were collected from, the items?
The only information I have of where they were collected from is something called a property receipt. And the property receipt is just a piece of paper that the agency or detective or deputy will fill out when they submit the evidence so that it can be tracked. And sometimes what will happen on the property receipt, they will actually write out where it was collected. However, I would be going by whatever's written on that property receipt.
And do you sometimes just notate the submission information by what it is, and you will put what they referred to it as?
Correct. So in this particular case, the 5 casings, as I mentioned before, they were casing 17, 19 through 22. Those numbers were numbers from the actual property receipt themselves. I don't know where those numbers came from.
Okay. Did you receive any other submissions as it relates to the 40 caliber pistol?
Yes, I received some fired bullets, and they were in submissions 2 and 9.
Submission 2. Okay, and what were, submission 2, we'll start with submission 2.
Okay.
What is it that you received?
I received multiple items in submission 2, but
As it pertains to the 40 caliber Glock pistol?
to the 40 caliber, there were 2 fired 40 caliber bullets or projectiles.
And what, if anything, were you able to do with those 2 submissions?
Well, I compared those bullets, again, microscopically, to the test fires, to test fires from the Glock pistol, and the results were inconclusive. And sometimes some firearms will not mark the bullets or casings enough for me to make a determination. I am able to say, though, they were consistent with being fired because they're the same caliber and had the same general markings, but I'm not able to say that those two particular bullets were fired from that exact pistol.
So they were consistent, but you can't say they were fired from that pistol?
Correct, and that has to do with just, again, that the markings just don't transfer well onto the projectile itself.
And those two copper jacketed bullets, were they labeled as projectile from left arm and projectile from left muscle?
That's how it was labeled on the property receipt.
Right, when it came to you?
Correct.
That's what they were labeled as?
Correct.
Okay. And after submission 2, what was the next submission you received? We went over 4, which would have been the actual firearm.
Correct.
And
Submission 2,
yes.
which were 2 projectiles.
Uh-huh.
And then submission 9. Submission 9 contained 2 projectiles, again, 2 .40 caliber 2 projectiles or bullets.
Okay, and what were your findings as to, you said submission 9, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay, and it was labeled as a .40 caliber copper jacketed bullet projectile number 1.
1, yes, and projectile number 4.
And did you make a comparison?
I made the same comparison and, again, the same conclusions. It's inconclusive. They were consistent with .40 caliber projectiles and the same type of markings. However, again, the unique markings there were not enough there to make an actual determination that they were fired in that particular firearm.
Was that also the same for submission 9, projectile number 4?
Correct, yes.
Okay. Were they consistent with being fired?
Yes,
Okay, from the .40 caliber?
yes.
Okay. And I just want to go back to submission 7. What was it you received in submission 7?
Submission 7 was 1 .40 Smith & Wesson caliber cartridge, meaning it's just an unfired piece of ammunition again.
And what was it labeled as?
It was labeled on the property receipt?
Yes.
You mean? On the property receipt, it was labeled as bullet next to Sean Henry.
Now, you said .40 caliber cartridge, and based on what you told us earlier, does that mean that this was a live round, we'll call it?
Yes, it was a live round, unfired.
So when you have a live round, there is no need for you to do a comparison. Is that correct? As far as you would do with if you only had a casing or a projectile or a bullet?
No, because since it's not fired, there's no determination to say what fired it because it's not fired.
Right, and you can just simply look at the cartridge and make a determination as to the caliber and what type of gun it can be put in to be fired.
Yes, because the caliber is stamped on the actual cartridge itself as to what caliber it could be fired in.
Okay. And then there was submission 10. What did you receive in submission 10?
Submission 10 was 1 Glock pistol magazine, and then there were also 11 .40 Smith & Wesson caliber cartridges.
And the Glock pistol magazine, what was it labeled as on the property receipt?
Submission 10 was labeled as magazine with bullets from Chris Vasata's pant pocket.
And again, you said caliber cartridges, meaning those were live rounds, we'll refer to them as live rounds?
Yes.
Okay. And were you able to say that those rounds could be placed into what you had labeled as submission for the .40 Glock pistol?
Yes, because they're .40 Smith & Wesson caliber, they can be fired in the .40 Smith & Wesson Glock pistol. Yes.
Okay. And is Perfecta the brand?
Perfecta is just the brand of ammunition. That's all that is.
And in submission 10, the magazine with bullets from Chris Vasata's pant pocket, were those Perfecta 40 cartridges?
Yes.
Okay. Moving on to submission 11, Mr. Felix, what did you receive?
Submission 11 was 1 box of ammunition from Perfecta, the manufacturer, containing 2 .40 Smith & Wesson caliber cartridges, and one bag containing 15 Perfecta 357 Magnum caliber cartridges, again, all unfired.
As to the 2 Perfecta cartridges, what was it labeled as on the property receipt?
From BMW.
And these Perfecta 40 caliber cartridges, are they similar or the same as those cartridges from submission 10, the 11 cartridges?
They're the same manufacturer and the same caliber.
Okay. Moving on to submission 15. What did you receive in submission 15?
Submission 15 was submitted was one, again, Perfecta 40 Smith & Wesson caliber cartridge.
Okay. And being alive, and what was that labeled as?
It was labeled as loose round cutout of left pocket of shorts from roadway 110 Paseo Way.
And again, nothing to compare because it was a live round.
Live round, yes.
Now, when you're doing your comparison, and in some instances making an identification, obviously you can't say who had the gun or who fired the gun, right?
No, I'm just making an identification that a particular firearm fired that piece of ammunition.
Okay. And were those all of the submissions you received as it pertains to the 40 Glock pistol?
Yes.
Okay. Did you also receive a rifle?
Yes, I did receive a rifle, yes.
Okay. And can you tell us about what you did when you received the rifle?
Should I describe the rifle first?
Yes.
Just the rifle that I received was a 7.62 by 39 caliber, Romarm model WASR 10 semi-automatic rifle. I also received one rifle magazine and 13 7.62 by 39 millimeter caliber cartridges made by Barnaul, spelled Barnaul.
Okay. And would that have been the cartridge? Would that have been an example of the first one that I put up on the overhead?
The larger caliber.
Yes.
Again, the caliber again is 7.62 by 39 millimeters, and again that's just the size of ammunition, which you showed an example in the beginning.
And what is the 7.62?
Basically, what the numbers mean, the 7.62 is if you were to take the bullet, the projectile, the top part, and you just measure the diameter in using millimeters, it would measure 7.62 diameters at its widest point. And then the 39 part of the cartridge is if you were to take the casing, just the casing part of itself, and you measure the length, it would measure 39 millimeters in length. So that's where the two numbers come from, the diameter of the bullet at its widest point, and then the length of the casing. That's all that means.
And did you test fire this rifle?
I did test fire this rifle, and it was functional, yes.
And did you use the ammo that was provided with the firearm?
I did not use the ammunition that was provided with the firearm. I used evidence. I used ammunition from the laboratory.
Okay. And were there submissions that you received that you compared to the rifle
Yes.
in this case?
Yes.
Okay. I want to start with submission 1. Can you tell us what you received in submission 1 and what it was labeled as on the property receipt?
Sure. Submission 1 was one fired 7.62 caliber hollow point bullet, and it was labeled on the property receipt as projectile from right scapula.
What does hollow point mean?
Hollow point is just a design of bullet in which the nose, the tip of the nose, is hollowed out. There's a little drilled out. And basically what it's designed to do is, upon impact, is designed to open up and create maximum damage. So as soon as it hits something, it opens up to create more surface area, which creates more damage to the target.
And this is from State's Exhibit 106. And is this something
It's difficult to say from the actual image up there, but I could receive both a projectile or a fragment. That would be considered a projectile. It's mostly intact, but there's a lot of damage to it, but it is a projectile.
You were able to make a comparison?
Yes.
Okay. And what did you identify this as?
That was a 7.62 caliber hollow point bullet.
Okay. And I believe you stated this was labeled as projectile from right scapula.
Correct. That's what it was labeled as, yes.
And in submission 2, did you receive anything as it relates to the rifle or 7.62 caliber cartridge or fragment?
On submission 2, yes. There was submitted a 7.62 caliber jacket fragment, so basically a piece of the projectile.
Okay. And what was that labeled as?
It was labeled as projectile from chest cavity.
What was the next submission you received as it pertains to the rifle?
As it pertains to the rifle, was submission 5.
And what was received in the evidence bag of submission 5?
Submission 5 contained 10 fired cartridge casings that were 7.62 by 39 caliber.
Okay, and the casings would have been the gray part that we put up on the overhead of the larger bullets.
Correct, the fired casings, yes.
Okay, and what were your findings or as to those casings? Were they labeled 1 through 10?
They were labeled 1 through 10, yes.
Okay, and what were your findings?
I was able to identify those casings as having been fired in the submission 14 rifle.
Okay. And submission 6, did you also receive 39 caliber cartridge casings?
Yes, I received 7 fired 7.62 by 39 caliber casings.
Okay, and how many were you able to identify as being fired from the rifle you received?
All of the fired casings that were 7.62 by 39.
Moving on to submission 8, what was contained in that evidence bag?
Submission 8 was one 7.62 by 39 cartridge, meaning it was unfired again.
Okay, when was that labeled as the bullet from the rifle chamber?
That's what it was labeled as, bullet from rifle chamber.
Okay, we know that to be a live round or cartridge.
Correct.
Okay. And submission 9, what did you receive?
As it pertained to the rifle, I received 2 fired 7.62 caliber jacketed bullets.
Were these also hollow point, if you know?
Yes, one of them was a hollow point. The other was not. The other was labeled. The other one was what's called a full metal jacket, meaning that it did not have a hollow point. It just had a complete nose or tip.
What we saw on the overhead?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And were you able to, after making a comparison, were you able to make an identification as to those 2 projectiles being fired from the rifle?
Yes, I was able to determine that the submission bullets, submission 9 bullets, along with the submission 1 projectile, and one of the 7.62 caliber bullet jacket fragments from submission 2, though all those bullets I was able to identify as having been fired in the submission 14 rifle.
Okay. What was the next submission you received as it pertains to the rifle?
After submission 9, it was submission 16.
Submission 16?
Yes.
Okay, and what did you receive?
Submission 16 were 6 cartridges, which were 7.62 by 39 caliber.
And what were they labeled as on the property receipt?
On the property receipt, it was labeled as bullets from sock, front right door pocket BMW.
And again, these are live rounds,
Yes,
okay? And so there's no need for us to, there's no comparison to make because they haven't been fired.
correct.
And they are bullets that could be used in the rifle that you received.
Yes, it's the same caliber cartridges that can be used, so they could be used in the Submission 14 rifle.
Now, were there some fragments or submissions you received that were fragments that you were unable to identify or eliminate?
There was a fragment in Submission 2 that was just too damaged and did not have any of the markings on it, so I was not able to make any type of identification or elimination to any of the firearms submitted in this case.
Okay. May I have just a moment, Your Honor?
Of course.
Just a few more things, Mr. Felix. The .40 caliber cartridges that you talked about that you received as submission, are those bullets that could have gone in Submission 3, the Taurus revolver?
No, for the 40 Smith & Wesson caliber cartridges are designed to be only fired in a 40 Smith & Wesson caliber firearm, so no, they could not be fired in the Taurus revolver, no.
Okay. And just to be clear, the items that you received 3 firearms,
Yes,
okay? And as a part of your comparison or analysis, you were able to go through and make a comparison, and in some instances, an identification as to whether certain projectiles or casings or bullets were fired from either the rifle or the .40 caliber firearm.
yes, depending on the piece of evidence, yes.
Right. Some instances it was inconclusive, but in others, there were, for the .40 caliber, you were able to identify casings that were fired from that gun.
Correct.
Okay. And as to the rifle, you were able to identify what is referred to as a hollow point bullet or projectile as being fired from that firearm.
From the rifle, yes.
From the rifle?
Yes, correct.
Okay. No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Okay. Cross? Yes, sir.
Well, just give me 5 seconds. I want to do it outside.
Your Honor, can we approach?
There have been cases where I tell them no. Not this group, not this group, not this group. Okay, we got to take up something outside your presence instead of you sitting there listening to that noise. Turn your pads upside down in your chairs, head back into the jury room, grab yourself a cup of coffee. We'll get you out as soon as I'm done with this legal issue. Please don't talk about the case.